Hello everyone, this is Alizir Chess here to help you to realize your potential. And today I have 5 games for you guys with the move 4 knight to b5. One is Nepo versus Jobava, and it's against g6 instead of e6 on move 3. And the other 4 games are going to be in the e6 variation. And I have a very good game by Hans to show you guys at the end of the video, okay? So stay tuned. So first we're going to look at Nepo versus Jobava. And here we have the immediate knight to b5. In a future video we're going to be covering e3, bishop g7, h4, and h5 ideas, as well as h6 ideas. But for now, we're going to be looking at the immediate knight to b5, which is met with knight to a6, e3, bishop to g7, knight to f3, castles. Here, knight to h5 could have been attempted, but after bishop to g5, h6, bishop to h4, g5, white has the move knight e5 available, and black also has c5 here instead of g5, as well as castling. So these are some alternatives for black instead of the move castles on move 6. Castles on move 6 is met by Nepo's move h3, which allows the bishop to stay on the h2 to b8 diagonal. So now after knight e4, c3, c6, knight goes back to a3, and knight to b8. Here it's also possible for black to play knight c7, and after bishop to e2, knight e6 attacks the dark squared bishop, which tucks itself on h2. But here after knight to b8, we have bishop e2, bishop f5, castles, knight d7, c4, and here Jobava goes wrong with the move knight to b6. Here the position is equal, but it's definitely harder for black to play. This knight on a3 is not as stupid as it originally looked, because it's now covering the c4 break. If black were to take it, the white knight comes into the center, controlling d6 and e5, and this is a slightly preferable position for white. Here, black could have played the move e6, and this would have been very good for black, despite the fact that it looks like his bishop gets trapped, because after the move g5, attacking white's bishop, white has to dart back to h2, because taking the bishop on f5 backfires, as the g file will open against the white king. The bishop on g7 covers the black king. The knight on e4 puts pressure on the f2 pawn, making it hard for the rook to move, and the black queen has access to the king side. If the white knight moves, then she can come to h4. Otherwise, she can come out to f6 and then cross over to h6 or to f5 or to g6 after an exchange of pawns. Black also has king to h8 ideas and bringing the rook to the g file. So this would have been a better idea for Jobava. But after knight to b6, rook c1, and yes, of course, Nepo didn't have to fall into that. He could have played bishop to h2 in that hypothetical situation, but it's no more than equal. But after the game continuation of knight to b6, we have rook c1, and black tries to open up the center with c5. White plays bishop to e5, and after an exchange, he takes with the pawn, opening the d file. And here, white is just slightly better, but it's closer to even if black plays either rook to d8. I would prefer moving the f-file rook, as it allows the king to get closer to the center if necessary. But here, Jobava goes for knight a4. Knight to a4 is simply not good due to the move g4. And now this knight on e4 is going to be stranded for quite a while here. Here, after taking, Nepo should kill this knight, because here black has to play bishop takes a2, and after rook to a1, bishop to b3, rook d7, White has advantage by pressurizing b7 and e7. And black has to play bishop takes pawn because, for example, if you play rook to b8, white has b3 here, and if bishop to e2, rook d7, the knight has to come back, and the rook can take the e7 pawn. Also, e6 might come, shattering your kingside formation. And c5 is also very weak, and b7 is weak. Black is lost here. So here, if we were to go for another variation, such as rook a d8, bishop takes, rook takes, rook takes, bishop takes, here, because c3 is no longer covered, like in the previous variation, b3 doesn't work due to knight c3 with a counter fork on e4 and d1. So here, white would have to play rook d7, and white is still better here. But after bishop to d3, bishop takes bishop, here black is back in the game with rook a d8. And after the exchange of rooks and rook c2, white is stabilized, but black is fine. But black has to find the best moves here, which Jobava does not find. Here, it was better to play a6, so this way we can potentially kick the bishop and get our queenside majority rolling. After knight to b6, bishop back to e2 is coming. It doesn't come right away because taking does not help black in this case, because the knight is hit. And after rook takes c5, black has just lost a pawn for nothing. Also, rook c7 is coming. So here, after king g2, king g7, now Nepo saves the bishop. And now he's going to reroute his pieces very soon. Again, he's playing with this idea of bishop c4 because the rook on d5 is hit. But here, black really should take it now because the pawn on c5 is also protected. So this is different from the last variation because the rook is on d5. This would again get Jobava closer to a draw. But after bishop to c4, rook d1, bishop back to e2. Now the rook has to go back to d5, but Nepo hits on the right idea with king f1, and he brings the king closer to the center, and he undevelops the bishop. Now the bishop can come to the long diagonal where it puts pressure on the knight, the rook, and the pawn. So all of these pieces are shish kebabbed. After knight back to g1, here Jobava simply gives away the extended c-pawn because if he doesn't, bishop g2 is coming, and then the knight's going to move to g5, and you're going to lose the pawn for no reason. And in the case of rook c7, bishop g2, let's say knight to g5 here, h4, you're actually going to lose a whole piece. And in the case of f5, to protect your knight, we have f3, knight g5, knight to e2, and after a move like knight to d5, king f2, we're protecting everybody. And here, black is much worse. And that's the best that black will be able to do, unfortunately, for Jobava. But after knight to g1, c4, he gives away the pawn. And after giving away the pawn, he's just totally lost now. Nepo ruthlessly proceeds with the advantage. The knight reaches d6. White wins a pawn. And now the game is just over. We have 2 extra pawns, and we can make a passed pawn on the queen side and the king side. This is now easy to win. So the takeaway from this game for you guys is, in this opening, h3, don't forget that to save the bishop. Also, the knight on a3 is not weak because it can support the c4 pawn push. And here, for black, you need to remember e6, because if g4 comes, g5 is an idea for black to save himself. So next we're going to look at Artemyev's game. Artemyev versus Radjabov. And we have the same opening moves. Now we have e3, c6, knight back to c3, and now queen to b6. And here after a3, don't play queen takes b2 and get caught with your hand in the cookie jar, because after knight to a4, bishop b4, king e2, and here the queen is trapped. You could also even take the bishop, and in this variation, the queen is stuck on a5, or the queen goes back to e7 to extricate itself, but in either case, black is totally lost. So instead, after bishop to e7, we have bishop to d3, c5, rook b1, and castles. And here, we're not worried about c4, unlike in some of the other variations that I've shown you guys, because we're not trying to break with e4 right away as white. So as after bishop to e2, castles, knight f3, knight b8, castles, knight c6. We have knight to e5 here. We have queen to d2 here. And we also have b3. Because after c takes b, black cannot play bishop takes a3 due to knight b5. And the bishop is under attack. And if it moves, we have bishop to c7, queen a6, and rook to a1, winning the queen. So after castles from black, knight to f3, bishop to d7, knight e5, c4 hitting the bishop now. Now it goes back to e2. We have rook f to d8. So this way the black bishop can go back to e8 without the f rook being trapped. And the bishop can go back to e8 in order to defend f7 as well as free up the d7 square for the f6 knight potentially. And here we see all of these moves come to life. And here white makes a mistake by castling, so I'm not going to show the rest of the game. Instead, I'll show what should have been played, which is knight takes knight. And after queen takes, knight takes. Here, if black tries to keep the pieces on, instead of bishop to h4, we can play bishop to h6. Now threatening mate in 2 with queen g4, queen g7. And after f5, queen f3, bishop to d6, g4, breaking open the king side. And if you take that, it's mate in 2. And if you don't take it, then you have to play f4 to jettison the pawn to keep the lines closed. And after e takes f4, keeping pieces on the board, this dark squared bishop cuts the king, so you don't want to trade it. Here, white is much better. White can even castle on the king side because the extended pawns and the bishop pair keep his king safe for the time being. Now we're going to look at Lysak versus Laura Lopez. And this game is also instructive. Even though it's between lower rated players, we have the immediate a3 here from white. c6, the knight goes back to c3. This knight on a6 is now stranded, so the white knight has done its job. White's also gotten in the move a3 here. And by the time this piece goes back to reroute, for example, we can see here that white has 4 moves, black has 4 moves, and it's now the 5th move for white. So white's basically just on par as he would be in any normal game without the knight dance. So here, after knight c3, bishop to d6, e3, bishop takes, pawn takes, we have the doubled f pawns. This is something that's important to keep in mind that you're going to get in these formations, but it's okay. After knight back to b8 from Lopez, we have knight f3, queen d6, and the knight diving into e5. Laura tries to break with the move c5, but after knight to b5, queen e7, white's advantage is growing. Lysak takes on c5, and after queen takes, pawn to c4, breaks open the light squares, as well as sets up for b4, and potentially c5 and knight d6 ideas going into the dark squares. After knight e4, we have queen c2, knight a6, bishop to d3, and now black played f5 here. The best move is to take on c4, and after this, we could even take, because after queen takes, knight takes c4. Yes, material is even, but position is not even here. If you castle, you run into bishop takes h7. If you play king to e7, white's just going to castle here. And if you play something like bishop to d7, you run into knight to d6 with a fork winning the queen. And what else can you do? If you play queen c5, then rook to c1 comes, putting pressure along the c-file. This position's already toast due to the fact that the light squared bishop for black has not gotten out of the gate, and the rook is therefore stuck, and the knight is stuck on a6 due to the opening from white. So here, after bishop d3, black tried f5, and after takes, this position is horrible for black, whose knight now gets kicked out. And once this knight is evicted, white's knight comes in, and black loses a pawn, and loses the game very easily. White just brings all the pieces in, plays b4 to control the c5 square. It's going to come in with the rook on the last rank and go after the pawns from behind. And this is game over. Yes, there was a blunder in this game, and we're going to come back to it. It's very inconsequential, though, in the grand scheme of things. White was always much better. And here the game's over. The passed pawn is going to roll through. If we go back to where the mistake was the move knight c4, here white could have taken, believe it or not, because rook takes knight doesn't work due to rook takes. And black has to play king to f8 and lose this h7 pawn. And white has 4 connected passed pawns, and this one black passed pawn is not going anywhere. Also, this pawn is a bit of a traitor because if this pawn didn't exist, knight to b6 would be possible with a discovery on the king, picking up the white rook on c8. So this pawn is a real betrayer here for black. Here, also, if we were to run the king to g6, we run into h4, and black has to play h6, because otherwise, let's say you waste a move, bishop to d3 is coming, and if you put the king over here, you're going to get mated because the pawn is not on h6 to cover a check. Now let's move to our next game, which is from Jobava himself versus Topalov. We're going to see doubled f-pawns in this game as well, guys. Here we have knight to c7, now knight to f3, and now bishop takes. The knight again hops into e5, and Jobava gets a nice dark squared grip in this game. First he exchanges the knight for the bishop to create a pin, and then once black breaks the pin, he exchanges the bishop for the knight, and now plays the move f5. It's also important that he gets rid of this knight because this knight is way better in this closed position than the bishop is. If the bishop were to, say, go back to d3, that's a strategic error of great importance because of the move c4 here. And black is damn near winning here because of b5, a5, and b4 coming. So, as a matter of fact, you could say black is just strategically winning. This is busted. So here, you have to give up the bishop for the knight. And after doing so, Jobava creates a nice dark square grip. You can't take on f5, by the way, because of taking, and after d4, taking wins a pawn, and after taking this way, rook takes d5 wins a pawn. So here, after f5, black plays queen e7, and after the rook comes to the middle, we have an exchange, and so far so good for Topalov. But here, this is just practically very difficult. White has a queenside majority here and just shuts out black's pieces. And here, in this position, black should have played queen to d7. Black has to try to keep the queens on. A sample line runs like so. And here, this is deemed dead equal by the engine. This is extremely complicated, though, as all queen endgames are. But after queen c4 from Topalov, we have rook to e3. And here he goes after the pawn on g2, which you can't really blame him for. He's also trying to get the king out of there. But the king is perfectly safe. Jobava just takes the pawn. And after check, the advantage grows as the king is perfectly safe on the third rank. The problem for black is he has no dark square control. So here, Jobava tries to get the queens off the board. Then he comes back and centralizes the queen. Look at this black queen all the way in the corner, while the white queen is in the center and very, very active and menacing. So here, rook to e7 was played, which misses a large chunk of advantage. But if queen to f4 was played, let's say king g7, now here we have king to c4, just running up the board, and if queen to f1, creating a pin, it doesn't really matter because the queen can come to e3, and here after something like king to h5, we have king b5 even, which is hilarious because let's say you play rook to e1 trying to pile up pressure on the pin, it actually backfires here. Because after queen to g3, let's say king to h5, queen takes rook, and you just lose a whole rook when you were trying to get the white rook. All of this is a lot to see though, so obviously I don't blame Jobava. Here he just trades the queens, and Topalov makes a final blunder by going after a3. After rook e1, the rook is trapped on that side of the board. And after b5, we have a resignation from Topalov, as it's going to take way too long to try to get back in play. After rook to f4, king c3 simply shuts him out. And if you try to keep checking, then both the pawns are going to run down the board to get to promotion and become queens. Now, the takeaway from this game here is all of that juicy dark square control that Jobava had, especially in this position after rook to e5. Like, look at this dark square control on d4, e5, and f4. Even though the position is technically equal, and even though Topalov played the best move, just allowing Jobava to get a queenside majority was enough for him to squeeze Topalov, who's a former world champion. So here, we're going to turn our attention to Hans Moke Niemann and look at the game of the hour. So here, fasten your seatbelts, guys. This is going to be a crazy ride. We have knight to b5 immediately, and here we have bishop to b4 check by David Anton Guijarro. And after the move c3, bishop to a5, e3, a6, knight back to a3 from Hans. And here we have castles, knight to f3, knight bd7, bishop to e2, knight e4, knight back to b1, and g5 here, which is one of the top moves. After the bishop goes back to g3, we have h5 here, attempting to trap the bishop. What is Hans doing in this position? Well, after the move bishop to d3, moving the same piece twice in the opening, as now we're attacking the knight on e4. After queen e7, bishop takes knight, pawn takes, knight to d2, going after little Johnny on e4. Well, Jobava plays h4. And here, Hans does something very, 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 very nasty. He simply takes on h4 and doesn't care. Because after takes, queen check, king over, queen check, king up, queen takes bishop. White is +1 here according to the engine, but for all intents and purposes, this is basically winning for white. The e-pawn is weak, the h-pawn is weak. The side squared bishop hasn't gotten out yet. The queen's rook is not connected to the king's rook. White is up a pawn, but it really feels like white is up 2 pawns here due to the double pawns on e6 and e4. The only thing wrong with Hans's position is the queen's knight would not be out yet, but after the move c4 and knight c3, we can rectify that. And Hans was great here, right? But here after bishop takes, Jobava does not fall for that. He plays f5, and after bishop back to g3, Hans has just managed to steal a pawn in broad daylight, the same pawn that was trying to kill him. So here after b5, h4, opening up lines, f4, here we have bishop to h2, and after e5, trying to open up the knight and open up the right squared bishop on c8. Here we have h takes g5, which is a mistake. Queen to h5 is better, according to our good friend Stockfish. And part of the reason why is that if pawn takes here, now we have knight takes e4. And after f takes, if e takes d, we have knight bd2 here. And if black takes on e3, knight to b3, if queen takes, queen to g5, king f7, castles, and here white is better according to the engine, but this is also crazy to have to risk giving up all of these pawns for black and give up a piece, for white, and giving up the piece. Instead, I like the way Hans handled the position over the way the computer did, because h takes is very natural. Now we have an open h-file to operate with. And after queen takes, we see that David Anton Jobava, who's no weakling, Jobava is 2694 at the time of this game, and he was a 2700 player at one time, falling for queen takes pawn. We have queen to b3 check, rook f7 to block, e takes f4, queen takes g2 is not possible due to rook g1 picking up the queen. And now after takes back, knight takes e4, queen g6, knight bd2, here bishop to b7, f3 to protect the knight on e4, and after c5 we can take, and after knight takes, rook comes to check, king d1. And now after bishop to b6, Hans removes the right squared bishop. And after queen takes g2, we can no longer play rook g1 due to the bishop on b6, but it doesn't matter. Knight to d6 anyway. And here, the game was over. Jobava resigned. And why did he resign? Because if queen takes rook was check, king to c2. If you take the other rook, queen takes comes in. And after knight takes, there's no way to stop queen g7 mate. You have to just delay it with these types of moves that the computer will play out, but no human will, because it's game over. And here, a takeaway for this game, is that after bishop to b4 check, we can just play our normal plan, bring the knight back to a3. Again, we don't have to worry about the bishop in this particular variation, because after g5, we can take on e4, tuck the knight back, and after h4, we can just simply take the free pawn. And the funny thing is, the computer is suggesting for black to play h4, but h4 just doesn't work. So this position is already miles better for white if the computer is going to recommend just simply using a pawn. And Jobava didn't make any particularly bad follow-ups according to the engine, and it's still just busted. The only thing he maybe could have done better was here he could have played queen to h7. But let's be real, guys. No human being's going to play a move like that that just invites queen g4. And the potential for losing a second pawn. Therefore, you can't really criticize Jobava too much in this game. He did all normal looking stuff. He threw in a check. The problem for him is this bishop got stuck on a5, when this bishop would have liked to be on d6, where it can fight against white's control over the e5 square. And maybe this whole idea with g5 and h5 is not the best. Maybe we need to go back to the drawing board on this, but I'm not entirely certain. Let me know what you think in the comments. Please like, share, and subscribe. And let me know what you would like to see in the next coming videos. I'm still going to be continuing with the Jobava tutorial. Again, we have other stuff to look at in the case of g6, e3, bishop g7, h4, and h5. So, and also h6. So, thank you guys for watching. Have a great day. Get better every day, guys. Peace.